My son-in-law forgot his phone at my house, and it wouldn't stop ringing with my daughter's name flashing on the screen. But she was sitting right next to me. When I answered and heard that sultry voice purring, "Hey baby, I can't wait to see you tonight," I knew my perfectly organized little world was about to explode. That voice belonged to Jessica Parker, the real estate agent who'd helped us buy this house 5 years ago. Where are you watching from today? Drop your location in the comments below and hit that like and subscribe button. Let me take you back to how this delicious disaster unfolded. It was Sunday afternoon, one of those crisp October days in suburban Minneapolis where the maple trees looked like they were showing off and normal families were supposed to be having normal conversations about normal things. Instead, I was about to discover that my daughter's husband had been playing house with someone else. David had left his phone on my kitchen counter after our usual family brunch. You know the kind, where everyone pretends their lives are perfect while making passive-aggressive comments about the casserole. Sarah was helping me load the dishwasher when that phone started its insistent buzzing. "Sarah, honey," David's phone announced in that annoying automated voice. "Sarah, honey calling." My daughter looked up from rinsing plates, her blonde hair catching the afternoon light. "That's weird. I'm right here. Why would I be calling David?" But I recognized that voice the moment I answered. Jessica Parker, the woman who'd spent 6 months showing us houses, who'd been just a little too helpful, a little too available, a little too interested in David's opinion on everything from granite countertops to school districts. "Well, hello there, sexy," she purred into my ear. "I've been thinking about last night all morning. When can you slip away from the family drama?" The plate Sarah was holding crashed into the sink. David came rushing into the kitchen at the sound of breaking ceramic, took one look at his phone in my hand and Sarah's face, and went pale as Minnesota snow in January. The silence stretched like taffy until Sarah finally spoke. "Mom," she whispered, staring at her husband. Who was that? Now here's where most mothers-in-law would hand the phone back and pretend they hadn't heard what they'd heard. But I've never been most mothers-in-law. At 68, I'd survived my own cheating husband, a bitter divorce, and raising Sarah as a single mother while building my own accounting practice. I don't do denial anymore. "That was Jessica Parker," I said clearly, watching David's face cycle through expressions like a broken slot machine. "And she seems to think she was talking to someone who spent last night with her." Sarah's wedding ring caught the light as she gripped the edge of the sink. They'd been married for 3 years. 3 years of Sunday brunches where David played the perfect son-in-law, complimenting my cooking and asking about my week. 3 years of watching Sarah glow with newlywed happiness while her husband apparently glowed with someone else. "David?" Sarah's voice cracked like ice on a pond. "David, tell me there's an explanation." But David was staring at that phone like it was a live grenade, and I could practically see the wheels turning in his head, calculating how much damage control he'd need to do. That's when I realized this wasn't just about catching a cheater. This was about watching my daughter's heart break in real time while her husband decided which lie would work best. And something fierce and protective rose up in my chest, something that had been dormant since Sarah left for college. The afternoon sun was still streaming through my kitchen windows, the coffee was still warm in our mugs, and the broken plate still lay in pieces in my sink. But everything had changed in the space of one misdirected phone call. David opened his mouth to speak, and I knew whatever came next would either save my daughter's marriage or destroy it completely. "It's not what you think," David said, which is exactly what every cheater says when it's precisely what you think. Sarah laughed, but it wasn't a happy sound. It was the kind of laugh that comes right before someone either throws something heavy or has a complete breakdown. "It's not what I think? David, she called you sexy and mentioned last night? What exactly should I be thinking?" I watched my son-in-law's face cycle through his options. Deny everything? Claim it was a misunderstanding? Blame the victim? After 40 years of watching people try to explain away their financial indiscretions in my accounting office, I could read guilt like a balance sheet. "Look, Jess is she's got boundary issues," David said, running his hand through his dark hair. "You know how she is. Always a little too friendly, a little too flirty. She probably had a few drinks and decided to call and mess with me." Oh, he was good. Not good enough, but good. Sarah wanted to believe him. I could see it in the way her shoulders relaxed slightly, the way she desperately grabbed onto his explanation like a life preserver. But I'd heard that voice. Jessica Parker hadn't been drunk dialing for kicks. She'd been talking to her lover, someone she was comfortable with, someone who'd apparently spent the night with her recently. "Sarah, sweetie," I said carefully, "maybe you should check David's phone, see if there are other calls or messages from Jessica." David's hand shot out reflexively, reaching for his phone. "That's not necessary." "Sarah, you know I'd never—" "Then you won't mind if I look," Sarah interrupted, her voice gaining strength. She held out her hand expectantly. The kitchen went quiet except for the ticking of my grandmother's clock on the wall. David stood frozen, his phone still in my grip, his wife's hand extended between us like a bridge he'd have to cross or burn. "Of course not," he said finally, but his voice had lost all its conviction. "I just think it's unnecessary drama over a drunk woman's inappropriate phone call." I handed the phone to Sarah, watching David's Adam's apple bob as he swallowed hard. Sarah's fingers moved across the screen with growing urgency. Her face went from hopeful to confused to absolutely devastated in about 30 seconds. 15 calls this week," she whispered. 15 calls to and from Jessica Parker. Text messages. Her voice trailed off as she read. Then she looked up at David with tears starting to form. "She texted you at 11 last night saying, 'Thanks for an amazing evening. Can't wait for Tuesday.' David, what happens on Tuesday?" "Tuesday." I filed that away for future reference. David's shoulders sagged like someone had let all the air out of him. "Sarah, I can explain. Can you explain this one too?" Sarah's voice was getting stronger, angrier. "From 3 days ago. The lingerie you like is on sale at Victoria's Secret. Should I pick up something new for Thursday?" My accounting brain was automatically cataloging the evidence. Multiple phone calls, intimate text messages, specific references to spending time together, a pattern of deception spanning weeks, maybe months. But my mother's heart was breaking watching Sarah's world crumble in real time. "How long?" Sarah asked quietly. David looked like he was going to be sick. "Sarah, it's complicated." "How long?" "6 months," he whispered. The words hit the kitchen like a physical blow. 6 months. Half a year of Sunday brunches where David had looked me in the eye and asked about my week while he was screwing around with the woman who'd sold us this house. Half a year of watching Sarah plan their future while he was planning his Tuesday and Thursday nights with someone else. Sarah set the phone down on the counter with deliberate care, like it was made of explosive material. Then she walked to the kitchen island and gripped the edge until her knuckles went white. "I need you to leave," she said to David without looking at him. "Sarah, please let me explain." "Leave, now. Go to Jessica's house, go to a hotel, go to hell for all I care. But get out of my mother's house and don't you dare follow me when I leave." David looked at me like I might intervene on his behalf. I raised an eyebrow that clearly said, "Not in this lifetime, sweetheart." After he slunk out like the coward he was, Sarah and I sat in my living room with fresh coffee and the ruins of her marriage spread out between us like a crime scene. "I should have known," she said, staring into her mug. "All those late nights, all those work dinners, all those times he couldn't quite meet my eyes when I asked about his day. I wanted to comfort her, to tell her it wasn't her fault, that cheaters are experts at deception. But I also wanted to know exactly how deep this betrayal went. "Sweetheart," I said gently, "what else might he be hiding?" Sarah looked up at me with red-rimmed eyes that suddenly held a spark of something dangerous. "You know what, Mom? I think it's time we found out." Monday morning found Sarah and me sitting in my home office like two generals planning a campaign. Sarah had called in sick to work, which was probably wise considering she looked like she'd been hit by an emotional freight train. But underneath the devastation, I could see something else emerging. Pure, focused fury. And nothing is more dangerous than a furious woman with an accounting degree for a mother. "I've been thinking about this all night," Sarah said, spreading papers across my desk. "If David's been lying about Jessica, what else has he been lying about?" Smart girl. I'd taught her well. "What kind of access do you have to your joint accounts?" "Everything. Online banking, credit cards, investment accounts. David always said he trusted me completely with our finances." She laughed bitterly. Turns out his trust issues were in a completely different area. We started with their joint checking account. David worked as a project manager for a construction company, pulling in decent money but nothing extravagant. Their expenses looked normal at first glance: mortgage, utilities, groceries, the usual suburban necessities. But I'd been doing forensic accounting for 3 decades. I knew how to read between the lines of financial statements like a detective reading clues. "Look at these cash withdrawals," I said, pointing to the screen. "Every Tuesday and Thursday for the past 6 months. $200 each time." Sarah leaned closer. "That's $1,600 a month in cash. What's he spending it on?" "Hotels would be my guess. Can't charge a hotel room to a joint credit card when you're cheating on your wife." We dug deeper. Sarah's hurt was transforming into investigative determination, and I felt a surge of pride watching her work. She had inherited my methodical nature and my complete intolerance for financial dishonesty. "Mom, look at this," she said, pulling up their credit card statements. "Jessica Parker Real Estate. He's been paying her something called consultation fees every month." "Consultation fees?" I snorted. "Unless she's consulting on bedroom techniques, I'd say that's creative billing." $600 a month in consultation fees," Sarah muttered. "For what? We bought our house 3 years ago." As we continued digging, the picture got worse. David had taken a second mortgage on their house without telling Sarah. Completely illegal since both their names were on the deed. He'd opened a credit card in his name only and run up $15,000 in debt. He'd even cashed out his 401k early and paid the penalties. "Sarah," I said quietly, "honey, I think David's in serious financial trouble." She was staring at the screen with an expression I recognized from my own mirror after my divorce, the look of someone realizing they'd been living with a stranger. "The consultation fees," she said slowly. "Mom, what if Jessica isn't just his mistress? What if she's helping him hide money?" Brilliant. Absolutely brilliant. I felt another surge of maternal pride. "Let's look at Jessica's real estate business," I suggested. "See what properties she's been handling recently." A few strategic Google searches later, we'd found Jessica Parker's real estate website and her recent sales history. Nothing immediately suspicious, but then Sarah found something interesting. "Look at this property she sold 6 weeks ago," Sarah said, pointing to a listing. 123 Elm Street. Sold to DB Enterprises for cash, well below market value. DB Enterprises, I mused. David Bradley Enterprises. Perhaps? But how would David have cash to buy a property? That was the $1,000,000 question. Or rather, the $150,000 question based on the property value. I was about to suggest we call my friend Martha, who works at the county clerk's office, when Sarah's phone rang. David's name appeared on the screen. "Answer it," I said, "but put it on speaker." "Sarah?" David's voice filled my office, sounding desperate and exhausted. "Please, we need to talk. I know you're angry." "Angry?" Sarah's voice could have flash-frozen water. "David, angry is when you leave the toilet seat up. This is beyond angry. This is me discovering my husband is a lying, cheating financial criminal." "What are you talking about? I never..." "Sarah, you're being dramatic. Wrong thing to say to my daughter when she's holding evidence of his lies." "Dramatic? David, I'm looking at bank statements showing you've stolen our financial security to fund your affair. I'm looking at credit card bills for hotel rooms and jewelry I've never seen. I'm looking at a second mortgage you took out on our house without my knowledge or consent. Tell me, which part of that should I be calm about?" The silence on David's end stretched long enough that I wondered if he'd hung up. "How did you..." he started, then stopped himself. "How did I find out? Really, David, you might want to reconsider who you married. I'm an accountant's daughter. I know how to follow a money trail." "Sarah, please let me explain." "It's not what it looks like." "Then why don't you explain what DB Enterprises is and how you afforded to buy property with Jessica Parker when you've maxed out our credit cards?" Another long silence. Then David's voice came back, smaller and more defeated than I'd ever heard it. "How much do you know?" Sarah looked at me and smiled for the first time since Sunday. It wasn't a nice smile. "Why don't you come over to Mom's house tonight around 7 and we'll compare notes. Bring Jessica. I think it's time we all had an honest conversation." She hung up before he could respond. "Sarah," I said admiringly, "that was masterful. I learned from the best, Mom. Now, what do you think the odds are that David and Jessica actually show up tonight?" I considered the question while printing out copies of all the financial evidence we'd gathered. "Oh, they'll show up," I said confidently. David's too panicked to think straight, and Jessica's too invested in whatever scheme they're running to let him handle this alone. Good, Sarah said, organizing the papers into neat stacks. Because I have a few questions I'd like answered. Watching my daughter transform from heartbroken wife to fierce investigator reminded me why I'd worked so hard to raise her to be strong and independent. Some lessons you hope your children never need to use, but when they do need them, you want to make sure they're ready for war. At exactly 7 o'clock, my doorbell rang. I have to admire punctuality, even in cheating scoundrels. David stood on my front porch looking like he hadn't slept, with Jessica Parker beside him wearing the kind of outfit that screamed, "I dress for male attention." She was younger than I'd remembered, maybe early 30s, with the kind of calculated beauty that came from personal trainers and expensive salons. "Margaret," David said awkwardly, "thanks for agreeing to this meeting." "Oh, I didn't agree to anything," I replied pleasantly. "Sarah demanded it, and I'm just providing the venue. Come in." Sarah was waiting in my living room, sitting in my late husband's leather chair like she was holding court. She'd changed into her best professional outfit, a charcoal gray suit that made her look every inch the competent businesswoman she was. Smart move. Never let them see you vulnerable. "Jessica," Sarah said with icy politeness as they sat down. "How lovely to see you again. I don't think we've spoken since you helped us buy our house 3 years ago." Jessica had the grace to look uncomfortable. David just looked trapped. "Sarah," Jessica began, "I want you to know that neither David nor I intended for this to happen." "Oh, please," I interrupted, settling into my favorite chair with a cup of coffee. "Spare us the 'we fell in love against our will' narrative. Adults make choices. Own your choices." Sarah pulled out a folder thick with printouts. "Let's skip the relationship drama and talk about the financial fraud." David's face went pale. "The what?" "The second mortgage you took out on our house without my knowledge or consent. The $15,000 in credit card debt you've hidden from me. The mysterious cash withdrawals that coincidentally match your hotel expenses with Jessica." Jessica shot David a look that could have melted steel. Clearly, she hadn't known he was being quite so sloppy with the evidence. "And then there's DB Enterprises," Sarah continued, pulling out property records. "The company that bought 123 Elm Street from Jessica's real estate agency for significantly under market value. Cash sale, no inspection, very fast closing." Now both David and Jessica looked sick. "Here's what I think happened," Sarah said, her voice gaining confidence. "Jessica found undervalued properties through her real estate contacts. David used our home equity and his retirement money to fund cash purchases through his shell company. They buy low, Jessica lists them again immediately at market value. They split the profits." "That's," David started, then stopped himself. "Illegal?" I supplied helpfully. "Yes. Using marital assets for undisclosed business ventures without spousal consent is quite illegal, not to mention the tax implications of unreported income." Jessica was staring at David like she was reassessing his intelligence. "You never told me you were using joint accounts," she said quietly. "Because he's an idiot," Sarah replied. "An idiotic criminal, but still an idiot." David finally found his voice. "Sarah, I was trying to build something for our future. The construction industry is unstable. I wanted to create additional income streams." "By stealing from me?" Sarah's voice rose. "By lying to me for months? By sleeping with your business partner while I planned anniversary dinners and talked about starting a family?" The last part hit both David and Jessica like a slap. Apparently, they hadn't considered how their business arrangement with benefits might affect Sarah's life plans. "How many properties?" I asked Jessica directly. She glanced at David, who nodded miserably. 4. We've done 4 transactions. Profit? About 60,000, David whispered. "Where's that money now?" Silence. Sarah leaned forward. "Where is my money?" "We reinvested it," Jessica said quietly, "into a larger property, a commercial building downtown. I had to admire their ambition, even as I wanted to throttle them both. So let me understand this correctly," Sarah said with dangerous calm. "You've taken approximately $100,000 of my money, used it to fund an illegal real estate scheme with your mistress, and tied up all the profits in a commercial building I knew nothing about." "It's not illegal," David started. Using marital assets for undisclosed business ventures is fraud, I informed him. Using false business entities to hide income is tax evasion. And doing it all while having an affair just makes it spectacularly stupid. Jessica was looking increasingly uncomfortable. David, you said you had your wife's permission for the business investments. Sarah laughed, but it wasn't a pleasant sound. Did he also tell you I was fine with him sleeping with you? The room fell silent, except for the ticking of my grandmother's clock. David looked like he wanted to disappear into my couch cushions. Here's what's going to happen, Sarah announced, standing up and smoothing her skirt. You're going to liquidate that commercial building immediately. You're going to return every penny of my money with interest. You're going to pay back the second mortgage and close those secret credit cards. And if we refuse? Jessica asked with a hint of challenge in her voice. Sarah smiled, and I felt a surge of maternal pride at how magnificently fierce my daughter looked in that moment. Then I call the IRS about your unreported income, the state licensing board about your real estate ethics violations, and my friend at the newspaper who writes about local business crime. Your choice. David opened his mouth to argue, but Jessica cut him off. How long do we have? 30 days, Sarah said. Full financial restitution and a signed confession detailing everything you've done. In exchange, I don't destroy both your careers and have you prosecuted for fraud. After they left, Sarah collapsed back into the chair and let out a shaky breath. Honey, I said gently, that was incredible. I learned from watching you handle Dad's creditors after the divorce, she said. You taught me that people only respect strength. What are you going to do about the marriage? Sarah was quiet for a long moment, staring out my front window at the darkening neighborhood. I don't know yet, she admitted, but I know what I'm not going to do. I'm not going to be the wife who pretends this never happened for the sake of keeping the peace. I reached over and squeezed her hand. Whatever you decide, you've got my full support. Thanks, Mom, for everything, for letting me figure this out here, for helping me investigate, for teaching me to fight back. That's what mothers are for, sweetheart. But as I watched Sarah gather up all the evidence we'd compiled, I couldn't shake the feeling that David and Jessica wouldn't go quietly. People with this much to lose rarely do. I just hoped my daughter was ready for whatever came next. 3 weeks later, my phone rang at 6 in the morning. Sarah's voice was tight with panic. Mom, they're gone. David and Jessica. I went to the house yesterday to get some more clothes, and all his stuff is gone. His car, his computer, everything. I sat up in bed, immediately alert. What about the commercial building? The money? I called the property management company. The building was sold 2 days ago. Cash transaction, all proceeds wired to an offshore account in the Cayman Islands. Those lying, thieving bastards. I'd underestimated their desperation and overestimated their stupidity. How much? I asked, though I dreaded the answer. $250,000. They took everything, Mom. The house equity, the retirement money, the profits from their scheme, everything. I was already getting out of bed, reaching for my clothes. Where are you now? At the house, or what used to be our house. I guess it's just my house now, if I can afford to keep it. I'm coming over. Don't touch anything else until I get there. The drive to Sarah's house gave me time to think and get angry. Really angry. The kind of anger that comes from watching someone hurt your child and realizing they've been planning it all along. Sarah met me at the door looking exhausted and defeated. The house felt empty in a way that had nothing to do with missing furniture. They planned this, I said, as we stood in David's cleaned-out office. This wasn't panic. This was an exit strategy. I should have seen it coming, Sarah said miserably. When they agreed too easily to my demands. When they didn't argue about the timeline. Honey, you're not a criminal. You don't think like one. They had a head start on planning this because they've been lying longer. But even as I comforted my daughter, my accounting brain was working through the problem. People who steal $250,000 don't usually stop there. They don't just disappear quietly into tropical paradise. Sarah, I said carefully, I think we need to call the police. I already tried. They said it's a civil matter since David had legal access to the joint accounts. They can't do anything about the offshore transfer unless we can prove it was intended to defraud creditors. What about the IRS, the State Real Estate Board? I filed complaints with everyone you suggested, but investigations take months, and David and Jessica are long gone. I walked through the empty house, thinking. Something was bothering me about their hasty departure, something that didn't quite add up. Sarah, show me exactly what they took and what they left behind. We went through the house room by room. David had taken his clothes, his computer, his personal papers, but he'd left behind some expensive electronics, his golf clubs, and most interestingly, his collection of financial books and investment guides. This is odd, I said, flipping through a book on international tax shelters. If David was planning to disappear with stolen money, why leave behind research materials on hiding assets? Maybe he was in too much of a hurry? Or maybe he's not done stealing. The thought hit me like ice water. I grabbed Sarah's arm. Honey, what other accounts did David have access to? What about your work retirement account? Your personal investment funds? Sarah's face went white. He can't access those. He'd need my authorization. Unless he forged your signature. You said he was good with false documents for the business entity. We spent the next hour calling every financial institution where Sarah had accounts. The news was worse than I'd feared. David had systematically liquidated everything he could access over the past 2 weeks, using forged authorization letters and claiming Sarah was out of the country on business. Her 401k, emptied. Her personal savings, gone. Even her grandmother's inheritance account that I'd helped her set up years ago, cleaned out. He took everything, Sarah whispered, staring at the phone statements. I have nothing left except my checking account and whatever equity is left in the house. How much equity? Maybe $50,000 if I'm lucky. Not enough to pay off the second mortgage he took out. I watched my strong, independent daughter crumble as the full scope of the theft became clear. David hadn't just cheated on her. He'd systematically destroyed her financial security over months, planning his escape while she planned their future. Mom, Sarah said in a small voice, I think I'm going to lose everything. That's when something shifted inside me. Some protective maternal instinct that had been simmering since Sunday's phone call finally reached a full boil. No, I said firmly. You're not. But I can't afford the mortgage payments without David's income. I can't afford to keep the house. I'll have to start over with nothing. Sarah, look at me. I waited until she met my eyes. Your father tried to leave me with nothing after our divorce. He hid assets, moved money, tried to claim business losses to avoid paying support. Do you remember what happened to him? A small smile tugged at the corner of Sarah's mouth. You destroyed him. I didn't just destroy him. I took everything he tried to hide and made sure he ended up worse off than if he'd been honest from the beginning. But Mom, that was different. Dad was still local. David and Jessica are gone. Honey, people who steal large amounts of money make mistakes. They leave trails, and they always get overconfident. I pulled out my phone and started scrolling through my contacts. What are you doing? Calling in some favors. Your mother knows people, sweetheart. People who are very good at finding money that doesn't want to be found. I hit dial on Martha Harrison's number. Martha was a forensic accountant who specialized in asset recovery for divorce cases. If anyone could track down David and Jessica's stolen money, it was her. Martha, it's Margaret Thompson. I need your help with a case involving offshore accounts and financial fraud. As I explained the situation, I watched Sarah's expression change from despair to hope to something that looked suspiciously like anticipation. How long will it take? I asked Martha. I then nodded at her response. 6 weeks, I told Sarah after hanging up. Maybe less if they made the mistakes I think they made. And then what? Then we get your money back. All of it. Plus interest, penalties, and damages. What if they've already spent it? I smiled, and I'm sure it wasn't a particularly nice expression. Then we take everything else they own, everything they ever will own, and we make sure everyone in their professional networks knows exactly what kind of people they are. Sarah stood up straighter, some of her natural fire returning. Mom, she said slowly, I think I want to learn how to do what you do. What do you mean? I want to learn how to hunt down people who think they can steal from others and get away with it. I want to make sure this never happens to anyone else. Looking at my daughter in that moment, I felt a surge of pride so intense it nearly brought tears to my eyes. Sarah had been broken, betrayed, and financially devastated. But instead of retreating, she was preparing to fight back. Well then, I said, let's go to war. Martha Harrison's office looked like a computer forensics lab had collided with a law library. Multiple monitors displayed financial data, legal documents covered every surface, and the woman herself looked like she could stare down a hostile audit without blinking. "Your son-in-law is an amateur," Martha announced without preamble when Sarah and I arrived for our meeting. "A greedy, overconfident amateur." She pulled up a series of financial charts on her main monitor. David Bradley and Jessica Parker thought they were clever opening accounts in the Cayman Islands. Unfortunately for them, they chose a bank that has cooperation agreements with U.S. law enforcement. "You found the money?" Sarah asked, leaning forward. "I found all of it. Plus, I found something much more interesting." Martha clicked to a new screen. "They didn't just steal your money, Sarah. They've been running this real estate scam for 2 years, with victims in 3 different states." The screen showed a complex web of shell companies, false identities, and financial transfers. David and Jessica had been systematically targeting divorced women, newly widowed women, and other vulnerable individuals in real estate transactions. "How many victims?" I asked. "At least 12 that I've identified so far. Total theft of approximately $1.8 million. Sarah gasped. "They've done this before, multiple times." "Oh, it gets better," Martha continued. "Jessica Parker isn't even her real name. She's actually Jennifer Walsh, originally from Phoenix. She's been operating under false identities in different cities, working with various male accomplices. David's not her first partner. David's not even her second partner. I found evidence of similar schemes in Colorado and Texas, with different men. She recruits local men with financial problems or gambling debts, seduces them, and uses them to access victims' accounts and properties." I felt a cold satisfaction watching this information sink in for Sarah. Her husband hadn't been special to Jessica. He'd been a tool, a useful idiot with access to money. "Where are they now?" Sarah asked. Martha pulled up surveillance photos. David and Jessica were living in a luxury resort in Costa Rica, apparently enjoying their stolen fortune. "Costa Rica doesn't have an extradition treaty with the United States for financial crimes," Martha explained. "They probably think they're safe. Are they?" I asked. Martha smiled, and it reminded me of a shark sensing blood in the water. "Not even close, because they made one crucial mistake." She clicked to a new document. They bought property in Costa Rica using the same shell company they used for their U.S. investments. That makes it proceeds from illegal activity, which means we can freeze it. "How?" "I've already filed paperwork with the FBI's International Asset Forfeiture Unit. By tomorrow, their Costa Rican bank accounts will be frozen and their property seized pending investigation." Sarah was staring at the monitor in amazement. "They're going to lose everything?" "Everything they bought with stolen money, yes. But Sarah, there's something else you need to decide." Martha pulled up another file. "The FBI wants to prosecute this as an organized fraud conspiracy. If you're willing to testify against them, they're looking at serious federal prison time." "How serious?" 10 to 15 years. Minimum. I watched my daughter consider this. 3 weeks ago, she'd been a trusting wife planning anniversary dinners. Now she had the power to send her husband to federal prison for more than a decade. What happens if I don't testify? They might get reduced charges, serve maybe 3 to 5 years. But the other victims deserve justice too. Sarah was quiet for a long moment, staring at the surveillance photos of David and Jessica lounging by a pool that her stolen money had paid for. "I'll testify," she said finally, "but I want to be there when they're arrested." Martha raised an eyebrow. "That's unusual." "Unusual situations call for unusual approaches," I said. "Is it possible?" "The FBI is coordinating with Costa Rican authorities for the arrest. If you're willing to travel to Costa Rica and work with federal agents, they might allow you to observe." Sarah turned to me. "Mom, want to take a trip?" 2 weeks later, Sarah and I were sitting in an FBI surveillance van outside the Hotel Presidente in San Jose, Costa Rica, watching federal agents prepare to arrest David and Jessica. Agent Rodriguez had been surprisingly accommodating about letting us observe the operation. Apparently, victims who were willing to travel internationally to see justice done earned a certain amount of respect from law enforcement. "Target acquired," came the voice over the radio. "Male subject is at the pool bar. Female subject is in the spa." Through the van's tinted windows, I could see David sitting alone at the poolside bar, wearing expensive clothes and looking like he didn't have a care in the world. The sight filled me with cold satisfaction. "This is happening," Sarah said quietly. "They're really going to be arrested." "Yes, they are. And then they're going to learn what happens when you steal from a mother and daughter who don't forgive easily." The coordinated arrest was beautifully executed. David never saw it coming. One moment he was sipping a tropical drink. The next he was face down on the pool deck with federal agents reading him his rights in English and Spanish. Jessica's arrest at the spa was equally satisfying. According to Agent Rodriguez, she tried to claim she was an innocent victim of David's schemes right up until they showed her evidence of her previous aliases and prior conspiracies. "Mrs. Thompson, Mrs. Bradley," Agent Rodriguez said, as the suspects were loaded into separate vehicles. "They'll be extradited to the United States within the week. The trial should begin in about 6 months." "What about the money?" Sarah asked. "Full restitution to all victims is part of the plea agreement the prosecutor is offering. If they don't take the plea, we'll seize everything anyway, and they'll face maximum sentences." As our plane lifted off from San Jose that evening, Sarah finally spoke. "I keep waiting to feel sorry for David," she said. "But I don't. Why should you feel sorry for someone who systematically destroyed your life for his own profit? I thought I'd feel, I don't know, guilty? Like maybe I was being too harsh?" I looked at my daughter, this strong woman who'd been through hell and come out fighting. "Sarah, David made choices. He chose to steal from you. He chose to lie to you. He chose to plan his escape while you planned your future together. You didn't make him a criminal. You just refused to be a victim. What happens now? Now we go home. You rebuild your life, and we wait for justice to take its course." But even as I said it, I knew this wasn't really over. David and Jessica would have lawyers, they'd have appeals, they'd have opportunities to cause more problems. That's when I started planning phase 2 of our campaign. Because sometimes justice needs a little help to truly be served. 6 months later, I sat in the federal courthouse watching David squirm in his defendant's chair as Sarah testified about the systematic theft of her financial security. She was magnificent, clear, precise, devastating in her factual recounting of his betrayal. "Mrs. Bradley," the prosecutor asked, "when you discovered your husband had liquidated your retirement accounts without authorization, what was your reaction?" "Disbelief," Sarah replied steadily, followed by the realization that the man I'd been married to for 3 years was essentially a stranger. David's lawyer objected to something, but I wasn't really listening to the legal maneuvering. I was watching the jury's faces as they absorbed the scope of David's crimes. 12 ordinary people learning how a trusted spouse could systematically destroy someone's financial future. Jessica was being tried separately, but her case was already decided. Faced with evidence of multiple prior fraud schemes under different identities, she'd taken a plea deal for 12 years in federal prison. David, apparently, still thought he could charm his way out of consequences. He was wrong. The trial lasted a week. The evidence was overwhelming: financial records, recorded phone calls, surveillance footage, testimony from other victims across 3 states. David's defense strategy seemed to consist entirely of claiming he'd been manipulated by Jessica, which might have been more convincing if the prosecution hadn't presented evidence that he'd been researching international money laundering methods months before he met her. When the jury delivered their verdict, guilty on all counts, David finally looked like he understood the magnitude of his situation. 15 years in federal prison, full restitution to all victims, and a criminal record that would follow him for the rest of his life. But as satisfying as the conviction was, I'd learned something important during the investigation. David and Jessica were small fish in a much larger pond. "Agent Rodriguez," I said, as we left the courthouse, "what happens to the real estate professionals who helped them with these transactions? The banks that processed the suspicious transfers? The lawyers who created the shell companies?" "That's a much more complex investigation," he admitted. "A lot of these people claim they didn't know the transactions were part of a fraud scheme. But some of them had to know. Proving knowledge versus willful ignorance is difficult in court." That night, over dinner at my house, Sarah and I discussed what we'd learned from the trial. "It's not enough," Sarah said firmly. "David and Jessica going to prison doesn't help the real estate agents who are still out there setting up similar schemes. It doesn't protect the next vulnerable person from being targeted. What are you suggesting?" I want to start a business. Mom. Something that helps people avoid financial fraud and helps victims recover when it happens anyway. I set down my coffee cup and looked at my daughter with growing admiration. What kind of business? Financial security consulting. We help people review their financial arrangements before major life changes, marriage, divorce, retirement. We teach them how to protect their assets, and when they've been victimized, we help them recover. That's actually brilliant. I've been thinking about it for months. All the research we did, all the techniques Martha taught us, all the connections we made with law enforcement, we could use that knowledge to help other people. The more she talked, the more excited I became. Sarah had taken her personal disaster and transformed it into a mission to help others avoid similar disasters. What would you call this business? Thompson Bradley Financial Recovery, she said with a smile. I'm keeping the hyphenated name as a reminder. A reminder of what? That trusting the wrong person can destroy your life, but refusing to stay destroyed can make you stronger than you ever imagined. 3 months later, we opened our office in downtown Minneapolis. Our first client was Rebecca Mitchell, a 60-year-old widow whose adult children were pressuring her to sell her house and invest the proceeds in their guaranteed return business opportunity. Something feels wrong about their pressure, Rebecca told us during our initial consultation. But they're my children. Shouldn't I trust them? Sarah and I exchanged glances. We'd heard this story before in various forms. Mrs. Mitchell, Sarah said gently, the fact that you're questioning their motives means your instincts are already working. Let's help you protect yourself. It took us 2 weeks to discover that Rebecca's son had gambling debts of nearly $50,000, and her daughter had been forging Rebecca's signature on financial documents for months. Another week to set up a legal trap that caught them in the act of attempted financial elder abuse. How did you know? Rebecca asked, after we'd helped her file charges and secure her assets. Experience, I said simply. Sometimes the people closest to us are the ones most willing to hurt us, because they know we won't suspect them until it's too late. Our business grew quickly, mostly through word of mouth. Victims telling other potential victims, lawyers referring clients who needed asset recovery, law enforcement agencies recommending us for fraud prevention education. Each case taught us something new about the psychology of financial predators and the vulnerability of their targets. But more importantly, each successful intervention felt like a small victory against the David Bradleys and Jessica Parkers of the world. Sarah, I said one evening as we reviewed our case files, do you ever regret how everything happened? The divorce, the trial, the way your life got turned upside down? She was quiet for a moment, looking through the window of our office at the city lights below. You know what I regret, Mom? I regret that I was naive enough to trust someone who didn't deserve it. But I don't regret fighting back. I don't regret refusing to be a victim. And I don't regret turning my worst experience into something that helps other people. Even though it cost you your marriage? That marriage was built on lies from the beginning. I just didn't know it yet. Now I know what real partnership looks like. She gestured around our office. This is what it feels like to work with someone who has your back completely. Looking at our partnership, mother and daughter, mentor and student, 2 women who'd refused to let criminals destroy their lives. I felt a profound sense of satisfaction. David had thought he was stealing Sarah's money and future. Instead, he'd inadvertently given her something much more valuable, the knowledge that she was strong enough to fight back and win. Some lessons are expensive, but the really important ones always are. A year after David's conviction, our phone rang with the kind of case that makes your blood run cold. Mrs. Thompson, this is Detective Lisa Park with Minneapolis PD. We have a situation that might require your expertise. I put the call on speaker so Sarah could listen. Detective Park explained that they'd arrested a man named Marcus Webb for attempting to murder his elderly mother with antifreeze poisoning. During the investigation, they discovered evidence that Marcus had been working with a network of people targeting seniors for financial exploitation. The attempted murder was just the final step, Detective Park continued. Marcus had already stolen over $200,000 from his mother through forged power of attorney documents and had convinced her to sign over the deed to her house. What do you need from us? Sarah asked. Marcus had a partner, a woman who helped him identify targets and forge documents. She's still out there, and we think she's moved on to new victims. We need someone who understands financial fraud to help us identify her pattern. An hour later, we were sitting in a police conference room looking at evidence that made my stomach turn. Photos of elderly victims, financial records showing systematic theft, and a clear pattern of predatory behavior targeting the most vulnerable members of society. The woman calls herself Patricia Kane, Detective Park explained. But like your previous case, we suspect that's another false identity. She poses as a home healthcare aide, gains the trust of elderly clients, then gradually manipulates them into signing over financial control. How many victims so far? I asked. 5 that we know of in the Minneapolis area. But we've connected her to similar crimes in Milwaukee and Chicago. Always the same pattern. She works as a healthcare aide for 6 to 8 months, gains complete trust, then disappears with everything the victim owns. Sarah was studying the victim profiles. These people were all isolated. No close family nearby, limited social connections. She's specifically targeting people who won't be missed right away. Exactly, and Marcus Webb was her muscle. Marcus Webb. When victims started getting suspicious or asking questions, he'd escalate to intimidation, or, in his mother's case, attempted murder. I looked at the photos of Patricia Kane from various surveillance cameras. Mid-50s, professionally dressed, the kind of woman who could easily pass for a caring healthcare professional. The kind of woman elderly people would trust with their medications, their daily care, and eventually, their finances. Detective Park, I said, we'll help however we can. But this woman is dangerous in a way that David and Jessica never were. She's not just stealing money, she's systematically destroying vulnerable people's lives, which is why we need to stop her before she kills someone. Over the next 2 weeks, Sarah and I worked with the police to analyze Patricia Kane's methods and predict her next moves. She followed a clear pattern. Identify isolated elderly targets through healthcare agency assignments, spend months building trust and dependency, gradually assume control of their finances, then disappear before anyone noticed the theft. She's smart, Sarah observed as we mapped out her known activities. She never stays in one city long enough to establish a pattern that local law enforcement would notice. But she made one mistake, I said, pointing to a financial record. She used the same offshore bank that David and Jessica used. Martha might be able to trace her money trail. Martha Harrison was intrigued by the challenge. This woman is much more sophisticated than your average fraudster, she admitted after reviewing Patricia's financial activities. But sophisticated criminals often become overconfident. 3 days later, Martha called with breakthrough information. I found her, she announced. Patricia Kane is actually Patricia Kowalski, originally from Detroit. She's been running variations of this scam for over a decade, targeting elderly victims in at least 8 states. Where is she now? According to her most recent financial activity, she's in Denver, Colorado. And Margaret, there's something else you need to know. What? She's not working alone anymore. She's recruited at least 3 other people, and they're operating as an organized ring. They've systematized the process. One person identifies targets, one handles the caregiving and manipulation, one manages the financial theft, and one handles cleanup when things go wrong. The scope of the operation was staggering. Patricia had transformed from a lone wolf predator into the leader of an organized criminal enterprise, targeting the elderly across multiple states. Detective Park needs to know about this immediately, Sarah said. This is way beyond a local investigation now. When we briefed Detective Park on Martha's findings, she immediately contacted the FBI. Within hours, our local case had become part of a federal investigation into organized elder abuse. Mrs. Thompson, Mrs. Bradley, Agent Martinez said during our first federal briefing, would you be willing to work with us as consultants on this investigation? Your experience with financial fraud and your understanding of victim psychology could be invaluable. Sarah and I looked at each other. We'd started Thompson Bradley Financial Recovery to help individual victims. Now we were being asked to help take down an entire criminal organization. What would that involve? I asked. Analysis of financial patterns, victim interviews, possibly testifying as expert witnesses if we make arrests. This could take months to fully investigate. Agent Martinez, Sarah said firmly, when we started our business, we promised ourselves we'd never let criminals like David and Jessica hurt vulnerable people without consequences. Patricia Kowalski and her network are hurting people who can't protect themselves. So that's a yes? That's an absolutely yes. 6 weeks later, we were part of a coordinated federal operation that arrested Patricia Kowalski and 7 members of her criminal network across 4 states. The investigation revealed they'd stolen over $3 million from elderly victims and had directly caused the deaths of at least 2 people who'd been denied proper medical care while under their supervision. Patricia herself was caught in Denver, posing as a healthcare aide for an 86-year-old retired teacher named Helen Morrison. When federal agents arrested her, she was in the process of transferring Helen's life savings to an offshore account. "You saved my life," Helen told us when we met her after Patricia's arrest. She'd already convinced me to sign papers, giving her power of attorney. Next week, I was supposed to sign over the deed to my house. Standing in Helen's living room, looking at this frail, elderly woman who'd come so close to losing everything to a predator, I felt the same fierce protective anger that had driven me since Sarah's first phone call about David's betrayal. "Helen," I said, "people like Patricia count on their victims being too embarrassed or too trusting to fight back. But you weren't too anything. You survived, and your survival helped us catch her. What happens now?" "Now Patricia and her network go to federal prison for a very long time," Sarah said. "And we make sure every healthcare agency in the country knows about their methods so other people like you don't become victims." Driving home that night, Sarah was unusually quiet. "Mom," she said finally, "do you think we're making a real difference? Or are we just playing an endless game of whack-a-mole with criminals?" I considered the question as we drove through the Minneapolis suburbs where ordinary people lived, ordinary lives, mostly unaware of the predators who specifically targeted their vulnerability. "Sarah, 3 years ago, you were a trusting wife who believed the best of people. David's betrayal could have made you cynical and bitter. Instead, it made you strong and protective of others. But there will always be more people like David and Patricia." "Yes, there will. But there will also be more people like Helen Morrison who survive because someone taught them to recognize the warning signs. There will be more elderly people who keep their life savings because someone educated them about financial predators." "You really think we're making a difference?" "I think we're making the difference we can make. And sometimes that's enough." But even as I said it, I knew our biggest case was still coming. Because Patricia Kowalski had mentioned something during her interrogation that kept me awake at night. She'd talked about a mentor who'd taught her advanced techniques for manipulating elderly victims. Someone who'd been running these schemes for decades and had never been caught. Someone who was still out there teaching others how to destroy vulnerable people's lives for profit. That person was going to be our next target. I was sure of it. The call came on a Tuesday morning in March, exactly 2 years after David's first arrest. Agent Martinez's voice was tense with urgency. "Margaret, we need you and Sarah in Washington immediately. Patricia Kowalski is ready to talk about her mentor, but she'll only speak with you two present." "Why us specifically?" "She claims you're the only victims' advocates she trusts to understand the full scope of what she's been part of. She wants to make sure her information leads to real justice, not just another plea bargain." 6 hours later, Sarah and I were sitting in a federal detention facility outside Washington, D.C., facing the woman who'd terrorized elderly victims across 8 states. Patricia Kowalski looked older than her 57 years, worn down by months in federal custody, but her eyes were still sharp, calculating. Even in prison orange, she projected the kind of competent authority that had convinced so many victims to trust her with their lives. "Mrs. Thompson, Mrs. Bradley," she said as we sat down, "thank you for coming. We're here because you claim to have information about other criminals targeting the elderly," Sarah said coldly. "Not because we have any interest in helping you personally." Patricia smiled thinly. "Fair enough. You want to catch the person who taught me everything I know about manipulating vulnerable people? We're listening. His name is Dr. Richard Hawthorne. He's a licensed psychologist who specializes in geriatric care. For the past 15 years, he's been using his position to identify and exploit elderly patients with significant assets." I felt a chill run down my spine. A licensed psychologist would have access to vulnerable elderly people, detailed knowledge of their mental state and family situations, and the professional authority to manipulate both patients and their families. "Where does he operate?" Agent Martinez asked. Multiple locations. He contracts with nursing homes, assisted living facilities, and hospitals across the Midwest. But his primary base is Chicago. Patricia pulled out a hand-drawn map of Dr. Hawthorne's network. The scope was staggering. Dozens of healthcare facilities. Hundreds of potential victims. A systematic approach to exploitation that made her own operation look amateur by comparison. How does it work? Sarah asked. Dr. Hawthorne identifies patients with substantial assets but limited family oversight. He gradually convinces them they're suffering from early-stage dementia or other cognitive decline. Then he recommends they assign power of attorney to someone they can trust, usually one of his associates, posing as a caring family friend or professional advisor. And the families just accept his diagnosis? He's very good at what he does. He documents everything carefully, uses medical terminology, provides convincing evidence of cognitive decline. Most families want to believe they're doing what's best for their elderly relative. Agent Martinez was taking detailed notes. How many victims are we talking about? Over the past 15 years? Probably 200 people. Maybe more. Doctor. Hawthorne keeps meticulous records of his successes. The number hit me like a physical blow. 200 elderly people systematically robbed of their life savings by someone they trusted to protect their mental health. Where are these records? I asked. He has a private office in downtown Chicago, separate from his official practice. That's where he keeps the files on his special patients and coordinates with people like me. Patricia, Sarah said, why are you telling us this now? What's in it for you? Patricia was quiet for a long moment, staring at her hands folded on the metal table. Because I realized something during these months in prison, she said finally. I became a monster. I convinced myself I was just taking money from people who didn't need it anymore. But I was destroying lives. Real people. With families. With hopes. With dignity. And Dr. Hawthorne? He's worse than I ever was. Because he has the authority and credentials to convince people his abuse is actually medical care. He's turned elder exploitation into a respectable profession. Agent Martinez closed his notebook. Patricia, if you're lying to us, or if this is some kind of manipulation to improve your situation— Agent Martinez, Patricia interrupted. I'm already serving 25 years in federal prison. I have nothing left to gain or lose. But Dr. Hawthorne is still out there, recruiting new people like me, training them in advanced psychological manipulation techniques, building a network that spans multiple states. She looked directly at me. Mrs. Thompson, you stopped me from destroying Helen Morrison's life, but Dr. Hawthorne destroyed dozens of people like Helen before I ever learned his name. The drive back to the airport gave Sarah and me time to process what we'd learned. Mom, Sarah said as we waited for our flight, this is different from anything we've handled before. If Patricia is telling the truth, Dr. Hawthorne has been operating for 15 years with complete impunity. Because he's hiding behind professional credentials and medical authority, I agreed. Families trust doctors to protect their elderly relatives, not exploit them. How do we even begin to investigate someone like that? Very carefully, and with a lot of help from people who understand the medical system. But even as I said it, I knew this case would test everything we'd learned about investigating financial predators. Dr. Hawthorne wasn't just a criminal. He was a criminal with professional authority, institutional protection, and 15 years of experience in avoiding detection. 3 days later, we were back in Chicago, meeting with a team of federal investigators who specialized in healthcare fraud. The briefing was sobering. Dr. Richard Hawthorne has an impeccable professional reputation, Agent Chen explained. Licensed psychologist, published researcher, frequent speaker at geriatric care conferences. If he's running the operation Patricia described, he's been very careful to separate his criminal activities from his legitimate practice. What's our approach? I asked. Surveillance, financial analysis, and undercover investigation. We need to catch him in the act of manipulating a patient or coordinating with his criminal associates. How long will that take? Months? Possibly a year or more. This level of investigation requires patience and precision. But patience had never been my strong suit, especially when vulnerable people were being hurt while we gathered evidence. Agent Chen, I said, what if there was a way to accelerate the timeline? What if we could make Dr. Hawthorne reveal himself more quickly? What are you suggesting? I looked at Sarah, who was beginning to smile with the same predatory expression I'd seen when she confronted David. What if we gave Dr. Hawthorne the perfect target? Someone wealthy, isolated, and apparently vulnerable to psychological manipulation? You want to go undercover? I want to become the kind of patient Dr. Hawthorne can't resist. And when he makes his move, we'll be ready for him. Agent Chen looked skeptical. Mrs. Thompson, undercover operations involving psychological manipulation are extremely dangerous. If Dr. Hawthorne is as skilled as Patricia claims, then he needs to be stopped before he destroys more lives, Sarah interrupted. My mother didn't come this far to play it safe now. Looking around that conference room, surrounded by federal agents who devoted their careers to protecting vulnerable people from predators, I felt the same fierce determination that had driven me since the day David forgot his phone at my house. Agent Chen, I said firmly, Dr. Hawthorne has spent 15 years convincing elderly people to trust him while he robbed them blind. I think it's time someone turned his own tactics against him. And if something goes wrong, then at least we'll have tried. But I have a feeling Dr. Hawthorne is about to discover that underestimating a determined woman is the biggest mistake he's ever made. 3 months of preparation led to this moment. Me walking into Dr. Richard Hawthorne's private office as Margaret Williams, a recently widowed 72-year-old woman with early signs of memory problems and a substantial inheritance I didn't know how to manage. The office was designed to inspire trust. Warm lighting, expensive furniture, walls lined with diplomas and certifications. Dr. Hawthorne himself was exactly what central casting would order for a trustworthy physician. Silver-haired, kind eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses, and the sort of gentle demeanor that made you want to confide your deepest concerns. Mrs. Williams, he said, rising from behind his mahogany desk. Please, have a seat. Your daughter mentioned you've been having some memory concerns since your husband's passing? Sarah, playing the role of my worried daughter, Linda, had set up this appointment after weeks of careful groundwork. We'd created an entire fictional history for the Williams family, complete with financial records showing substantial assets and a recent death that left me vulnerable and confused about managing money. Doctor, I'm so worried about her, Sarah said, her voice perfectly pitched with concerned daughter anxiety. She's been forgetting appointments, mixing up dates. And last week I found her trying to write a check for $18,000 to some charity she'd never heard of before. Dr. Hawthorne made careful notes, his expression growing more interested with each detail Sarah provided about my apparent cognitive decline and financial vulnerability. Mrs. Williams, he said gently, these kinds of changes after a significant loss are quite common. The stress of grief can absolutely affect memory and decision-making capabilities. I played my part perfectly, thanks to weeks of coaching from FBI behavioral specialists, confused but trying to maintain dignity. Worried about my mental state but defensive about my independence. Exactly the kind of patient Dr. Hawthorne had been exploiting for 15 years. I just don't understand all these financial things Harold used to handle, I said, allowing my voice to quaver slightly. The lawyers keep sending me papers about trusts and investments, and it's all so confusing. How much are we talking about, Mrs. Williams? In terms of assets that need management? There it was. The question that revealed his true interest wasn't in my mental health, but in my financial worth. Well, I said, pretending to be uncertain, Harold left me the house, which is worth about $400,000, and there's some kind of retirement account worth maybe $700,000, plus his life insurance. I trailed off as if the numbers were too overwhelming to contemplate. Dr. Hawthorne's eyes lit up briefly before he controlled his expression. $1.2 million was exactly the kind of target that had made him wealthy over the past 15 years. Mrs. Williams, that's a substantial amount of money to manage, especially during a time of grief and adjustment. Have you considered establishing a power of attorney arrangement? Someone who could help you make financial decisions while you focus on your emotional recovery? What's a power of attorney? I asked innocently. For the next 20 minutes, Dr. Hawthorne explained how a power of attorney could protect me from making poor financial decisions while I was emotionally vulnerable. He recommended someone who specialized in helping widows manage their inheritance. A woman named Catherine Porter, who just happened to be one of his criminal associates. She's helped several of my patients navigate similar situations, Dr. Hawthorne assured me. Very trustworthy, very experienced with complex financial arrangements. Should I bring my financial documents to show her? That would be very helpful. Bank statements, investment accounts, insurance policies, anything that gives her a complete picture of your situation. Everything was proceeding exactly as Patricia Kowalski had predicted. Dr. Hawthorne was following the same pattern he'd used on hundreds of victims. Establish trust through medical authority, convince them they needed help managing their finances, then refer them to an associate who would systematically steal everything they owned. Dr. Hawthorne, Sarah interjected, would it be possible for my mother to have a few sessions with you to work through her grief before meeting with this financial advisor? I want to make sure she's thinking clearly. Of course. In fact, I'd recommend that. Grief counseling can significantly improve cognitive clarity. We scheduled 3 more appointments, giving the FBI time to gather evidence of Dr. Hawthorne coordinating with Catherine Porter and documenting his manipulation techniques. 2 weeks later, I was back in his office, this time wearing a wire that would capture every word of his psychological manipulation. "Mrs. Williams, how are you feeling about your financial situation?" he asked during our grief counseling session. "Oh, doctor, I'm so confused. I tried to balance my checkbook yesterday, and the numbers just didn't make sense. I'm scared I'm losing my mind like my mother did." Memory problems are very common at your age, especially after trauma. That's why it's so important to have trustworthy people helping you make important decisions. Have you heard back from that financial lady you mentioned? Catherine? Actually, yes. Catherine reviewed the financial summary you provided, and she's very concerned about some of the investment choices your husband made. She thinks there might be opportunities to protect your assets more effectively. What kind of opportunities? Dr. Hawthorne leaned forward with practiced sincerity. "Mrs. Williams, I need to be honest with you. Some of your husband's investments were questionable. Catherine believes you could lose a significant amount of money if you don't take action soon." There it was. The manufactured urgency designed to panic vulnerable people into making hasty decisions. What should I do? Catherine can help you transfer your assets to more secure arrangements. It would require giving her temporary power of attorney to act on your behalf, but it could save you hundreds of thousands of dollars. Temporary power of attorney? Just until your grief subsides and your cognitive clarity improves. Probably 6 months to a year. Dr. Hawthorne had no way of knowing that everything he was saying was being recorded by federal agents positioned throughout the building. He had no idea that Catherine Porter was actually an undercover FBI agent who'd been gathering evidence about his criminal network for months. "Doctor," I said, "I'm ready to meet with Catherine. When can we arrange that?" "How about tomorrow afternoon? I'll call her right now and set it up." As Dr. Hawthorne reached for his phone to coordinate with his criminal associate, I felt a surge of satisfaction that had been building for 3 years. From the moment David forgot his phone at my house, I'd been learning that the best way to deal with predators is to become a better predator yourself. Tomorrow, when Dr. Hawthorne and Catherine Porter tried to steal my fictional fortune, federal agents would arrest them both. Patricia Kowalski's information would lead to the dismantling of the entire network. Hundreds of elderly victims would finally see justice. But more importantly, hundreds of future victims would be protected from ever experiencing the betrayal and devastation that had started Sarah and me on this journey. "Thank you, doctor," I said, as I prepared to leave his office for the last time. "You've been so helpful. I feel like I can trust you completely." Dr. Hawthorne smiled with the confidence of someone who'd successfully manipulated vulnerable people for 15 years. He had no idea he'd just tried to manipulate the wrong woman. 24 hours later, Dr. Richard Hawthorne, Catherine Porter, and 12 members of their criminal network were under federal arrest. The investigation led to the recovery of over $8 million in stolen assets and the identification of more than 300 victims across 12 states. Standing outside the federal courthouse after Dr. Hawthorne's arraignment, Sarah and I watched him being led away in handcuffs. "Mom," Sarah said, "do you remember what you told me the day we found out about David's affair? You said some lessons are expensive, but the really important ones always are." "I remember." "What was the lesson we learned?" I thought about everything that had happened since that Sunday afternoon when David's phone wouldn't stop ringing. The betrayal, the investigation, the trial, the business we'd built, the criminals we'd caught, the victims we'd protected. We learned that being betrayed by someone you trust is devastating, I said finally. But refusing to stay a victim can transform you into someone stronger than you ever imagined. And we learn that the best revenge isn't getting even. It's becoming someone who protects others from experiencing what you survived. Sarah smiled and linked her arm through mine as we walked away from the courthouse. You know what, Mom? I think David accidentally did us a favor. How's that? He thought he was stealing my money and my future. Instead, he gave me something much more valuable, a purpose, a business, and the knowledge that I can survive anything. Plus, I added with a grin, we got to watch him get sentenced to 15 years in federal prison. Well, Sarah laughed, that was pretty satisfying too. 3 years after my son-in-law forgot his phone at my house, I'm no longer the trusting mother-in-law who believed family loyalty meant unconditional financial support. I'm the co-founder of one of the Midwest's most successful financial recovery firms, the woman who helped bring down one of the largest elder fraud networks in federal history, and proof that underestimating a determined woman is the biggest mistake any criminal can make. Some phone calls change everything, but sometimes that's exactly what needs to happen. Thanks for listening. Don't forget to subscribe and feel free to share your story in the comments. Your voice matters.